Welcome to Marblehead Revelations. This morning what you're going to learn about Marblehead is about the fact that we had an underground railroad here in town, that in the 1850s and around there we were smuggling slaves up to Canada and doing a lot of illegal things at great risk to Marbleheaders. And the person who's going to tell us what she knows about it is Pam Peterson, who has written a book called Marblehead, Myths, Legends, and Lore. It's absolutely fascinating, and the Underground Railroad only takes 2 pages, so there's so much more you could learn about Marblehead, but this morning we're going to focus on the slaves. Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1780. Were we one of the first to abolish it?
Yes. Massachusetts, for a variety of reasons, and I think one of them was the economy, that essentially, in terms of the kinds of work that was being done in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the slaves weren't really a necessary part of the workforce. The establishment of colonies in New England and the establishment of colonies in Virginia were very different.
Right.
People who came to Virginia essentially were wealthier people who were given large land grants with the intention of building plantations. And essentially we associate the term plantation with slavery, but plantations were just large farming endeavors,
Right.
So they knew that they needed before they even came to the New World large numbers of workers. And the initial plan actually for a lot of early plantation owners was to take the Native Americans and capture them and use them as slave labor.
But they didn't work out.
It didn't work out because unfortunately the Native Americans didn't do well in captivity and they kept dying.
Yeah.
So that was a problem.
But here in Marblehead, I know in the whaling crews there were often black sailors.
Yes.
Free men who signed on.
So the slaves that were coming into New England and were acquired generally by wealthier members of society were primarily ship captains, and they received slaves essentially as part of the money owed to them. So if they received part of, they received cargo and goods, and the slaves were considered goods. So we know, for example, Jeremiah Lee had 3 slaves that were house servants that he most likely acquired in some business transaction, and they were freed at the time of his death, and which, but many other. As I say, primarily ship captains were the people who held slaves. There's a well-known, the Isaac Royal House, which is in Medford, Massachusetts, has is I think the only property in New England that has existing slave quarters that you can actually see. And they were used. Some were house servants, and there was some land that they were farming.
So prior to 1780, there would have been quite a few slaves in the kitchens of the wealthy Marbleheaders, doing the cooking, child care, stuff like that.
I wouldn't say quite a few, because Marblehead, but
we were poor.
Yeah.
We didn't have that many rich families.
But of course, by the 1750s, 1760s, Marblehead was a very prosperous town. It was one of the wealthiest towns in the American colonies before the American Revolution. So, as I said, there would have been some slave population, and of course the Joseph Brown, who was served in Glover's regiment and was an African American, was a freed man.
Slave.
And Gingerbread Hill was essentially the location where most black colonists lived, and that continued through.
And they were free slaves living
Yes,
there. Yeah,
yeah.
and having quite a lively
Yes,
community, right?
absolutely.
With Old
Yeah.
Joe's Tavern and
And
all that.
yeah.
Well, then, about 28 years later, the U.S. made a law saying that no more slaves could be imported. And in 1832, we waited another 20 years at least, an anti-slavery society came into being here in Marblehead. How did that come about? Who belonged to it? Was it open?
Yes, it was open. Lynn, Massachusetts, was actually very much of a center of abolitionism. Frederick Douglass
Lived in Lynn.
lived in Lynn,
Right.
spoke in Lynn. There were many.
And Marbleheaders would have gone to hear him, right?
Yes, yeah, and so that was kind of the center. But there were abolitionist societies all throughout New England, Essex County. Andover had a large abolitionist society, and so these people would gather together for meetings and rallies and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing about the Underground Railroad is that we think of it as existing primarily in the 19th century, so from the 1820s, 1830s, but actually there was an Underground Railroad from colonial times, and people who, during the American Revolution, there was a lot of concern about slavery. There were various petitions to end slavery at the time that the Declaration of Independence.
On moral grounds.
On moral
right,
grounds,
right.
yes. The British used slavery against the colonists because they offered black men the opportunity, if they would join the British troops and fight against the colonists, that they would be freed.
And did many slaves take them up on it?
Some did, and some were afraid to do it because of because then they would also then be brought to England.
Right. An unknown future, and what if the British lost?
Right. And what would happen to their families, and would their
Right.
families be allowed to go with
punished,
them, and
yeah.
all that sort of things. But there was, from colonial records of slaves escaping to the north, because there was not the system of slavery. So if they, even in colonial times, so some of these patterns were in existence for a very, for well over 100 years.
So what's so interesting to me is they formed these anti-slavery societies, and instead of just going there and saying, tisk, tisk, should we write letters to the president or whatever, they decided to let the slaves somehow who escaped to come into Marblehead, hid them in their houses, and then sent them by boat, right, from the harbor up north, and they
Right.
were heading for Canada.
Right.
Now, where would they put them?
The whole system, and then one of the reasons that the Underground Railroad was called the Underground Railroad, is that they used the real railroad actually a lot. And there was a whole language that developed, and slaves who were being transported were referred to as packages. So they could send messages, and they'd say 2 packages will be arriving.
We used to have a railroad come into
Yes. Into Marblehead.
and into Marblehead.
Right.
People don't remember
Right.
that there was where we have now the tracks.
Right.
Were the tracks.
Yes.
And we had trains coming right in, so they'd come up from Boston.
Yes. So they actually came from Philadelphia. Was a major sort of terminus.
Yeah.
And if people could get from wherever they escaped in the South to Philadelphia, varieties of ways that they would transport the slaves. There were wagons that were specially built with a false bottom, so people could lie in the bottom, and then if they were stopped, then they could check. They would examine the wagon and look under the cargo or whatever. They wouldn't see that there was a
Right.
false bottom there. and then people were actually smuggled onto trains, and many times the conductors were sympathetic to the cause. Um,
And
and
one came in a box?
Yes, Henry Box Brown was his name, and he escaped from the South, and was literally packed in a wooden box, and he stayed for a day and a half in the box, and he was delivered. He came out of the box in Philadelphia, and but he eventually came on and actually was one of the slaves that came through Marblehead, and the reason that Marblehead became aside from having sympathizers, the important thing was obviously that it made geographic sense for slaves to be brought there, because they would be brought to Marblehead and hidden until there were vessels that were going to Halifax, to Canada, and so Marblehead, Newburyport, a lot of the Portland, Maine, there were lots of different locations, and Marblehead was particularly good because if the slaves got to Marblehead and they were hidden, then at night, when there was a vessel that was leaving, it would often go out of the harbor and wait just behind Brown's Island and Gary's Island, and they would row the slaves out to the slave,
Yeah.
and out to the boats, and then they would be loaded on, and then no one would see them.
Right. So they didn't go out of the harbor.
That's as far as we know, but it seems like that would have been a good way for them to be smuggled on board without it being in broad daylight and
Right.
people seeing them get onto the ships.
Now, at this point, it was only the slaves who were in danger, because if they were captured, they might be punished when they got back. But in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and that put the rescuers at risk, correct?
Yes, absolutely, and it became very dangerous, because if they were caught, they were subject to fines and prison terms as well. So it really kind of raised the stakes on whether you really were going to help somebody.
And so did the Marbleheaders just quit?
No, no.
And from what you told me before, they kind of were lawbreakers anyway, right? They had these secret places in their houses.
Because we were talking about whether sort of hidden places in people's houses were specifically for the Underground Railroad, and I would say probably not. I don't think that anyone's built something just for that. But there's a long tradition of all kinds of things being smuggled by Marbleheaders and by all the people that lived along the coast.
And the Marbleheaders were not proper like the Salemites. They had their own kind of direct ways of doing things, right? And one of them was, if you didn't want to pay a tariff or taxes or something, you just secreted.
They didn't get away with doing that for everything. The geography of Marblehead has influenced its character, and I think some of the qualities that we still see in Marblehead, of people being very independent. They don't like to have someone tell them what to do.
I remember when we didn't want to send our sewerage to Salem.
Right.
It was our
Right.
waste products. What did they smuggle?
Well, early on, in the early colonial times, there were, obviously tariffs on all kinds of imported goods. And so they most definitely, one of the favorite things always to smuggle has been alcohol. So rum, and that was being brought in from the West Indies. Other kinds of luxury goods that would have had higher tariffs on them anyway could have been smuggled. And as I say, was mainly a way to avoid paying.
So these spaces where they had been hiding in the past, liquor and contraband were available, like what?
Well, in a lot of the colonial houses, the space under the stairs, which
Could be disguised.
could be
Yeah.
disguised. I mean, that's usually an
Yeah.
open space or a closet or whatever. Beside the fireplaces, on either side of the fireplace, often there were cupboards. There were warming cupboards, and they would use those to keep linen in to warm it for the bedtime.
Great idea.
I know. A very efficient
So
use
they could seem to close that in.
yeah, so they could,
Yeah.
with paneling or whatever, make it look like that wasn't, that there wasn't any
Right.
open space there. The root cellars, where that most people had, where they would store, in the winter, they would store vegetables that they wanted to keep and use through the wintertime. And those could be, they often had trap doors, and so people could hide down there. So there were places in the houses.
I have a booklet here put out by the National Park Service, and these are all owned privately now, so you can't go visit them. But if you want to walk by the outside, the A.C. Orne House on 21 State Street was used. So was the Ambrose Allen House, which is on 9 Merritt Street. And the Simeon and Betsy Dodge House on 236 Washington Street. So if you pass by those houses, 21 State Street, 9 Merritt Street, 236 Washington Street, you will see houses where, if you use your imagination, you can imagine that there are slaves hiding under the stairs beside the fireplace or in the root cellar. And Simeon and Betsy Dodge were leaders of
Yes,
this
yeah, they were
abolition of this Underground Railroad.
Underground Railroad, and they were the Marbleheaders who were are most often referenced. One of the things that's difficult and frustrating about finding any real documentation about the Underground Railroad is that it was so secret that it's not not written down as to what they did or how
Right,
how
or
they did
reported
it.
in the paper.
Right.
They didn't write, we smuggled out 6 slaves this
yeah.
week.
And in fact, in terms of documenting the Underground Railroad, one of the newspapers are a good source because they often report the capture of slaves. And there were also advertisements that slave owners could put into the newspapers, and it describes a particular slave who has run away and what his characteristics are and what he looked like and
Let me
what his
read you
skills are.
one of these. This was out of the Boston Gazette. Run away from his master, Mr. Timothy Perkins of Middleborough in the county of Essex. So this was a Massachusetts slave who ran away. A Negro servant named Pompey of a middle stature. Fellow has lost 1 finger from one of his hands. Whosoever shall take up said Negro and convey him to his masters shall have $4 reward, and all necessary charges paid. And there are a lot of them in here. So every day you would pick up the paper and there would be an ad of a fugitive who might actually be under your stairs.
Yes. And there were, in fact, bounty hunters who that was their business, that they made their money tracking down runaway slaves.
Were any Marbleheaders ever punished under that fugitive slave law?
No, no.
We closed ranks, right? People didn't squeal.
Right. And of course, the Fugitive Slave Act was 1850, and by 1861, Lincoln declared war on the southern
That's still
states.
11 years.
11
though.
years, yes. No, so it's a long time, and it was it did really escalate the whole situation. And this is the time when Uncle Tom's Cabin was written,
Raising the consciousness
and
of the
more and more
country.
people became aware of the situation and became more and more polarized, because they, for a long time, it was possible to remain relatively neutral and just not take a position because you didn't know that much about it.
You know, it's so interesting. We think now that the Republicans and the Democrats are at each other's throats, and it seems very upsetting to everybody that it should be this kind of conflict. But when you look back between the pro and the negative slavery people, I mean, it ended in a war.
Yes, yeah.
So the country has been split a lot more than now. That's a good thing to think of.
Yeah.
So Simeon and Betsy Dodge were are the names we associate in Marblehead, like the leading family
Right.
of the anti-slavery movement. But we have another famous Marbleheader who did something pretty wonderful, Joseph Story, for whom the Story School was named. And what did he do?
Well, he was actually Joseph Story, who also is claimed by Salem as well, even though he was born. Yes, I know, it's distressing. But his father, who was Dr. Elijah Story, was a very important figure in the American Revolution, and was actually one of the red men who dressed up at the Boston Tea Party. And so Judge...
As an Indian, right? He dressed up as an Indian,
and
yeah.
As I said, they referred to themselves as
the red men.
But Joseph Story was one of 13 children. He was born in a house on Washington Street, and
well, he's a Marbleheader.
He is a Marbleheader,
yes.
But he became the youngest Supreme Court justice ever, and I think he may still be the youngest who was appointed to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. And in the 1840s, he was one of the judges that heard the case of the Amistad, where the
there's a movie about that.
Yes,
so you can, if you want to know more about the Amistad, you can enjoy watching this movie
it is
and
a
learning
wonderful,
history.
very well done movie.
Yeah.
So that was one of the many important things that Story did, but certainly that.
But what did he do?
Well, they actually ruled. This was a slave ship that was captured, and the court case dealt with what to do with these slaves.
Because they had mutinied, right?
Right.
And illegally taken over the ship.
And so whether they should be, who they should be returned, because they were in transit as far as ownership. I mean, they were being transported from one place to another. And actually, John Adams was the one that was the prosecutor for the case. And Adams was quite an elderly man at the time, and not.
He wanted them to be returned as slaves.
No, he was their defender.
Defense. Oh,
yeah.
He was their defender. Oh,
right,
good. Glad to clarify that.
It was in retirement at the time, and not planning or looking for another cause. And so he took on this case, which is very wonderfully described in the movie of his.
So John Adams is in the movie, but
yes.
Joseph Story is not.
Joseph Story is just one of the justices, so he's not a principal character.
And which John Adams was it?
It was John Quincy Adams.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Yeah. Right. As to clarify that. Right.
So then he did his part in ruling that they should be set free, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so as I say, I mean, there's certainly the whole issue of slavery certainly is something that was of concern to many, many Americans, even in colonial times, as to, so I mean, it was, I think, an issue that people struggled with, and it was a topic of discussion during the Declaration of Independence, that, creating all men being created equal, that during the Continental Congress it was raised, but what about the slaves?
Yeah.
And at that time, obviously, they made the decision not to include black Americans or women in the
equal
the
people.
Right.
So Marblehead has a lot to be proud of in this.
Does, yeah.
Not only the people who took part in the Underground Railroad, but the people who kept their mouths shut and who protected them and didn't turn them in.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I know in Germany, when people were hiding Jews, it was just very dangerous because you weren't supported by the general population.
Right.
But here, there was sort of a united front.
It certainly
to a great
appears that way.
extent.
I'm sure that there were people with differing opinions, but I don't think they acted on them.
Now, Pam, besides writing this book, Marblehead Myths, Legends, and Lore, what do you do? You're You work for the Historical Society?
Yes, yes, I do. I'm the executive director there. And it's a private nonprofit museum and historical society. I think one of the fascinating things about Marblehead history is that it's really fascinating, and there's a lot of important things that happened in Marblehead that go beyond our local pride. And in so many categories. Culturally, there were a lot of important things that have begun in Marblehead. Marblehead pottery, which is very important in arts and crafts. Well, the first marine flight in the world was in Marblehead Harbor. So Marblehead is a very important site for early aviation history.
So the point is, we have a lot to live up to.
We do.
This is not just a bedroom community where you sit and you commute and you aren't interrelated. If we're going to continue to make history, we have to be brave and stand up for what we believe in a political period which is very crucial right now. I mean, it seems to be a turning point in the history of whether we're going to continue to have a democracy as we've known it in the past or not. So one thing about learning this history is it inspires you to know that the people who lived in your house were brave.
Yes. Well, I think one of the fascinating things about history is that you realize that while this individuals' circumstances may change, that people are essentially the same, and that they have the same kinds of concerns, and that making a moral decision is always difficult. It was difficult for people in the American Revolution to decide: were you going to side with the with the revolutionaries, or were you a Tory?
Yeah.
Were you going to be loyal to the crown? And there were lots of good arguments, pro and con, for each choice that people made, and certainly all during the events that led up to the Civil War. Were you going to help people who were subjected to slavery, or was that not something that you felt was your concern?
Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. That's interesting.
I hope we've illuminated a very brief little period in Marblehead's history for you, and that it's inspired you to think of the people who lived here before us and who made decisions that were a risk. And we hope we can bring you more insightful looks at the people who are our, would you say, inspirational forefathers?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for watching.